The most dangerous thing in the fate-bound realm was not a sword or a king or an army of bound wolves. It was a woman who had swallowed her own power and survived anyway, and the silence she carried like a scar across her throat. Nobody in Carltonville knew this. That was the arrangement. That was the entire architecture of the life Leonora Strohm had built here, stone by careful stone, over 4 winters of grinding valerian root in a basement that never fully warmed and eating bread heels at midnight and keeping her collar high enough that no one ever saw the blue light leaking through her skin. She was known in the lower ward as the Silent Healer. It was not a name anyone had given her with tenderness. The cold came in through her knuckles first. Not the ambient cold of a basement in winter. That kind she had learned to breathe around, the way you learn to breathe around old grief, steadily, carefully, without letting it expand into the full space of your lungs. This was different. This was the cold of stone that had never once been warm, pressing upward through the floor into her kneecaps, traveling her wrists while she worked, settling into the architecture of her finger bones until her hands felt like something borrowed rather than owned. She kept grinding. The valerian root wasn't going to powder itself. And if she stopped moving, she would start thinking. And thinking in Carltonville on a night like this was a luxury she had long since learned she could not afford. Above her, through the timber ceiling of the healer's basement, the Blood Moon Festival was beginning. She could hear it building in layers, boots on cobblestone first, then drums finding their rhythm from somewhere near the square, and beneath both of those, threading through every gap in the floorboards and every crack in the mortar, the sound of unmated daughters calling. Howling. High and clear and practiced, shaped the way silk was shaped by a skilled hand, deliberately, beautifully, for a specific audience. Every noble family within riding distance had sent their finest she-wolves tonight. Silver gowns. Winter bloom perfume. Voices trained since childhood to carry exactly the right note of power and softness and availability, aimed like arrows at a single target. Alpha King Alfred Esclick had arrived at the North Gate an hour ago. Every unmated wolf in the fate-bound realm knew his name. Every Alpha family with an unmarried daughter had spent 6 months engineering a reason to be in Carltonville tonight. Every howl rising through Leonora's basement ceiling was a calculated performance. Hope dressed as instinct, ambition dressed as fate. Leonora kept her eyes on the mortar. She kept her collar high. She kept her hands moving. The safest place in Carltonville tonight was underground, and she had known it the moment the ravens arrived 3 days ago carrying the royal seal, and her frost-sealed throat had pulsed once, just once, like a door testing its own hinges. She had silenced her own howl 4 years ago. Before we continue, tell me in the comments. If hiding your voice was the only way to survive, would you do what Leonora did? And if you enjoy powerful werewolf romances filled with secrets, destiny, and unforgettable alpha kings, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Now let's find out why Leonora Strohm chose silence over being found. Not metaphorically. Not in the soft language people reached for when they meant loss. She lost her voice, she lost her wolf, something was taken from her. Nothing had been taken. She had done it herself, with deliberate hands and a clear mind and the specific, terrible clarity that comes when survival narrows to a single decision. She had mixed ice root and frost lichen into a paste by candlelight. She had heated it the way frost magic required, inward rather than outward, cold that burned from the inside rather than the surface. She had pressed it against the hollow of her throat, against the place where a wolf's voice vibrated through human skin, against the exact point where her howl lived when it rose. And she had held it there. She had held it there while her wolf, the ancient, pale creature that lived somewhere in the architecture of her chest, behind her ribs and below her sternum, had thrown itself against the seal with everything it had. 6 days. 6 days of screaming that no one outside her skull could hear. 6 days of pressure behind her eyes and ice crawling through her vocal cords and the particular grief of something enormous being made very, very small. On the 7th day, her wolf went quiet. Not dead. She had checked for that in the weeks that followed, pressing inward the way you press a bruise to confirm it still registers as pain. Her wolf was alive. It was simply contained. Frozen at the source. Locked in the same silence she now carried everywhere she went. No howl meant no call. No call meant no alpha in the fate-bound realm could follow the thread of her voice through the dark, could trace the bond, could find her the way they had been finding her since she was old enough to understand what her howl did to the wolves who heard it. That had been the point. That had always been the entire point. The blue cracks were the price she paid for it. Fine lines of frostlight that traced her collarbones and curled upward along the sides of her throat, brightening whenever the seal strained, whenever something with alpha blood came close enough to make her buried wolf remember what it had once been capable of. She kept them covered with the same wool collar she had mended 11 times. She kept her hood up in the market. She moved through Carltonville the way water moved through stone, not by force but by finding the path of least resistance, the route that drew the fewest eyes. It had worked. For 4 years it had worked. The door at the top of the basement stairs opened without a knock. Petra descended the way she always descended, as though the stairs existed primarily for her convenience and Leonora was simply a piece of equipment she occasionally needed to address. She was the senior healer of the lower ward, a woman whose competence was genuine and whose warmth had been rationed out so carefully over the decades that there was very little of it left for anyone below a certain social threshold. She set a bundle of fever wraps on the shelf beside Leonora's work table. Her eyes moved across the mortar, the arranged medicine packets, the organized rows of remedy jars. She found nothing wrong with any of it, which was the closest thing to approval that existed in Petra's vocabulary. Festival crowds always come in sick by morning, she said to the shelf rather than to Leonora. Too much cold air. Too much pride. Too much wine consumed while standing in a snowfield trying to impress a man who hasn't looked at any of them yet. She picked up one of the completed packets and turned it in her hands. Set it back down. Have the lung warmers ready. And the frostbite salve. We'll need twice the usual supply. Leonora nodded. Petra went back upstairs. The exchange had lasted less than a minute. No question about whether Leonora had eaten. No acknowledgement that she had been working since before dawn. No recognition that she was a person rather than a function the basement performed. That was Carltonville. That was the specific and unremarkable texture of every day here, and Leonora had stopped expecting it to be otherwise approximately 3 winters ago. The cruelty in this town was not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announced itself, that left marks you could show anyone, that gave you something solid to push against. It was structural. Built into the daily arrangement of things the way cold was built into stone. She ate when the work was finished, which meant she ate what remained, which most evenings was bread gone hard at the edges and broth that had cooled past wanting. She slept behind the medicine crates in the back room because the upstairs quarters were for healers with names that people had written down somewhere and agreed to remember. She had no such name here. She had arrived during the worst blizzard in living memory, voiceless and alone and half-frozen, and the town had absorbed her the way a body absorbs a splinter, working around her, accommodating her presence without ever quite acknowledging it. Nobody in Carltonville wanted a history that might require them to act on it. She was the silent healer. That was all. Her stomach had been empty since morning. She had been calculating, in the careful background arithmetic that hunger made necessary, what the festival scraps might look like by midnight, whether there would be roasted meat tonight, or only the bread rinds and cooling soup that constituted a normal evening. Festival nights usually meant real food passed through the healer's door, because festival nights meant people ate too much and drank too much and then required tending for the consequences. And people who required tending sometimes left things behind. She was running this arithmetic when the frost seal shifted. Not cracked. Not broke. Shifted, the way ice shifts in the deep part of a river, slow and massive and impossible to stop once it starts. A single pulse traveled from the base of her throat upward, so strong it made her teeth ache. Her hands went still. The pestle sat in the mortar. She did not pick it up. She pressed 2 fingers to her throat instead, feeling for what she already knew was there. The blue light was already spreading, past the collarbones, further than it had traveled in months, tracing lines she had memorized and managed and was now watching exceed every boundary she had established. Her wolf had been silent for 4 years. It was not silent now. It wasn't howling. It wasn't surging against the seal the way it had during those first terrible days. It was doing something she had no previous experience of, something that had no name in the vocabulary she had built for managing it. It was listening. Head up. Body still. Every buried instinct angled toward something she could not yet see or name, something above the basement ceiling, beyond the festival drums, past the careful performance of 100 howling daughters who had spent their whole lives being exactly the kind of wolf the world expected. Leonora's eyes moved to the ceiling. She pulled her collar up with fingers that had gone stiff, not from cold, not from the stone floor's permanent chill, but from something that moved through her blood like a current finding its direction. He was here. She didn't know how she knew. She had never met Alfred Esclick. She had spent 4 years ensuring she would never be in a room where a man like him might look in her direction. She had built her entire life in this town on the foundational principle that powerful things could not find what made no sound. She picked up the pestle. She went back to grinding. But the blue light beneath her collar was still spreading, still brightening, and her wolf was still listening with every buried sense it possessed. and the cold that had just entered the room through no open window, through no crack in the stone, through no gap she could account for. That cold was not winter. The last time her wolf had stirred like this, 3 alpha packs had burned a forest to the ground fighting over the sound of her voice. That was before she understood what she was. She had spent 4 years becoming someone no one looked for. She was beginning to suspect she had run out of time. The Blood Moon Festival of Carltonville was, by every measure that mattered to the packs of the fate-bound realm, a performance. Ice sculptures lined the main square, wolves mid-howl, frozen in attitudes of power and grace, their carved eyes catching the bonfire light and throwing it back in orange and amber. The fires themselves burned in iron baskets the size of carts, tall enough to push the cold back 20 feet in every direction and fill that space with the smell of pine resin and roasting meat. Musicians played from the raised platform near the north fountain. Noble daughters moved through the crowd in silver gowns that had been chosen to catch moonlight specifically, their hair braided with frost flowers, their howls released in careful intervals. Not too eager, not too restrained, pitched to suggest both strength and availability in the precise ratio that alpha tradition rewarded. Everyone was performing. Everyone was also watching the gate. Alfred Esclick entered Carltonville the way winter entered a room, not loudly, not with announcement, but with the immediate and total certainty that the temperature had changed and nothing would be quite the same until he left. He wore black and deep blue, trimmed in fur that moved in the wind off the mountains, and a crown that was not decorative. It was old and dense and shaped like something that had been forged to be worn into battle rather than to festivals. His wolves flanked him in formation. His face was still. That was the thing people remarked on after. Not his height, not the breadth of his shoulders, not the wolf sigil worked in gold across his chest. They remarked on the stillness. The quality of attention he gave to everything, complete, unhurried and slightly unsettling, the way a very large predator is unsettling even when it isn't moving. The crowd parted ahead of him and closed behind him, and every unmated daughter in the square lifted her voice at once. A chorus of practiced howls that rose above the bonfires and the music and the drums and floated out over Carltonville's rooftops into the cold night sky. Alfred walked through it without breaking stride. He reached the center of the square. He stopped. His second stepped close. "My king." Alfred said nothing. His wolf had gone completely, perfectly still inside him. Not the stillness of disinterest, but the acute stillness of a creature that has heard something no one else can hear and is working to locate the source. It wasn't a howl that caught it. Every howl in a half-mile radius was currently aimed at Alfred like an arrow, and his wolf had assessed each one and set each one aside without effort. It wasn't a scent. The festival air was thick with perfume and pine smoke and the layered musk of 100 wolves in close proximity. It was the absence. A gap in the sound. A missing note in the chord the night was playing. Something that should have been there, something his wolf had been calibrated across generations of bloodline and ancient bond to recognize, and it was gone. Sealed away. Hidden beneath silence so complete and so deliberate that finding it felt less like following a trail and more like pressing your hand against a wall and feeling very faintly the heat of a fire burning on the other side. He turned. He walked away from the festival. The crowd watched in absolute silence. The howling stopped, the drums faltered, the musicians lost the thread of the song one instrument at a time. Alfred moved through the main square and into the narrower streets beyond it, through an alley between the chandler's shop and the wool merchant's storehouse, across a snow-covered courtyard where an old well sat frozen at the center, down a lane that grew darker and quieter with every step until the festival was only a glow at his back and a distant murmur. He stopped in front of a low door set into the foundation of the healer's building. He stood there for one moment. Then he opened it. The stairs descended into warmth and the smell of medicinal herbs and tallow candles. He took the stairs slowly. At the bottom, behind a work table crowded with remedy packets and a stone mortar, a woman in a dark wool cloak looked up. Her eyes were the color of winter water. Blue light cracked across her throat like frost finding a fracture, sudden and luminous and unmistakable, and his wolf, which had been silent and searching for the better part of an hour, spoke its first word in years directly into the center of Alfred's chest. "What?" He stood very still in the doorway. She did not move either. But her hands, he noticed, had gone completely white around the pestle, and the blue light spreading beneath her collar was getting brighter. He asked her name first. Reasonable enough, a starting point, the smallest possible request. He had settled onto the stool beside the work table uninvited, his crown set aside on the shelf above the fever wraps as though it were a hat, his hands open and resting on his knees in the deliberate posture of a man who understood that he was the most dangerous thing in the room and was trying to make that fact temporarily irrelevant. Leonora looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached beneath the work table and produced a small chalkboard, the kind healers used to note remedy quantities, slate gray and worn smooth at the edges. She wrote 2 words and turned it toward him. Go away. Alfred read it. Something at the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. That's not your name. She turned the board back. Erased it. Wrote again. Please go away. Also not your name. He did not move. His wolf was pressed close behind his eyes, alert and steady and absolutely certain in a way that Alfred's mind was still catching up to. I'm not going to claim you. I'm not going to touch you. I would like to understand what I'm looking at. Leonora looked at the blue light curling out from beneath her collar. She pulled the wool higher. She went back to her work. You stayed. He asked the townspeople instead. The next morning, while Leonora worked and refused to acknowledge that the Alpha King of the fate-bound realm was conducting interviews in the healer's upper ward with the focused patience of a man who had nowhere else to be, Alfred moved through Carltonville and asked quiet questions of anyone who would answer them. Most knew very little. What they offered came in fragments, delivered with the particular discomfort of people describing something they had never looked at directly. She arrived during the great blizzard 4 winters ago. Alone. No pack markings. No luggage. Half frozen and voiceless and asking nothing of anyone, which was the part that seemed to have made her easiest to absorb and easiest to ignore. She never spoke. Not once in 4 years. Wrote everything. Kept to the basement. Did the work. Ate last. Wolves avoided her, not with fear exactly, but with the sideways unease of animals encountering a scent that didn't resolve into anything familiar. Something that registered as almost alive, almost wolf, almost present but not quite any of those things. Several of Carltonville's wolves had described it independently in different words, and arrived at the same conclusion. She felt like a door that had been sealed from the inside. And on full moon nights, the lower ward sometimes reported a faint blue glow through the healer's basement window. Like moonlight through ice. Like something cold that was also, somehow, burning. Alfred listened to all of it without expression. He went back to the basement in the evening. The flashback came to Leonora while he sat there, not for the first time, not even the 100th, but sharper now, edged the way memories got when something in the present made them relevant again. She had been 17. A forest in the eastern provinces, burning at 3 points simultaneously because 3 alpha packs had decided that the question of who owned her voice was worth killing each other over. She had stood in the center of it with her hands pressed against her own throat, listening to wolves die in the dark between the trees, and understood with the cold clarity of a person who has just run out of options that the only way to stop being the thing everyone fought over was to destroy the thing they wanted. She had not been cursed. No enemy had done this to her. No rival pack, no jealous alpha, no ancient punishment handed down through bloodline. She had done it to herself. Alfred had been watching her face. She didn't realize how much of it had shown until he leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice careful and low. Someone cursed your Howl, he said. Who was it? Leonora picked up the chalkboard. She wrote for longer than usual. Set it on the table between them and did not look at his face when he read it. No one cursed me. I sealed it myself. I ground the magic into my own throat and held it there until my wolf stopped screaming. If my voice returns, they will find me. They have never stopped looking. Alfred read it twice. The second time his jaw tightened, just slightly, just once, and then went still again. Outside, the blood moon had risen to its highest point over Carltonville. Neither of them moved. He did not come back with questions. That was the first thing she noticed. The second morning after the festival, Alfred arrived at the basement door at the same hour as before, actually knocked, which no one in Carltonville had ever done, and when she didn't respond he left a bowl of hot soup on the top step and went away. No conversation requested. No entry taken. Just soup. Still steaming. Leonora looked at it for a long time before she picked it up. The third morning he brought bread. Real bread, the kind from the baker on the upper ward that Leonora had smelled for 4 winters and never purchased because the cost was 2 coppers more than she could justify. The fourth morning he repaired the basement window latch that had been broken since autumn without being asked, working in silence with tools he had apparently sourced himself, and left without mentioning it. He was not performing patience. That was what undid her, eventually. A man performing patience watched to see if it was working. Alfred simply waited. As though he had decided she was worth the duration and had made his peace with however long the duration turned out to be. On the 5th day she wrote him a longer message than usual. My name is Leonora Strohm. I don't expect that means anything to you. It meant a great deal to the wrong people once and I have spent 4 years making sure it meant nothing to anyone. Alfred read it. Set the chalkboard down. Met her eyes. Tell me, he said quietly, what it means. She wrote for a long time. The Moon Howl bloodline was old, older than the current pack system, older than the Alpha King title, older than most of the lore that the fate-bound realm scholars considered ancient. It was a matrilineal line, passed mother to daughter across generations, manifesting rarely and without warning as a wolf voice of unusual power. Not unusual in volume or range. Unusual in effect. A Moon Howl vessel did not simply call. When a true vessel howled, wolves listened in ways that went beyond instinct. Pack bonds clarified, forced claims shattered, sleeping wolf spirits stirred in bodies that had given up on them. In battle, a vessel's howl could turn bound wolves free in a single note. In a dying wolf's last moments, it could ease the passage. In the presence of false authority, alphas who had claimed rank through force rather than bond, it made them kneel whether they intended to or not. Leonora wrote all of this in the careful, abbreviated style she had developed for the chalkboard. Then she wrote the part that mattered most. This is why they hunted me. Not because of what I was. Because of what I could give whoever held my bond. A controlled vessel is a weapon that never needs reloading. Kingdoms have fallen over smaller advantages. She set the board down. Looked at her hands. For a moment, just one, the careful accounting she maintained, the constant management of what she allowed herself to feel, slipped. I have not lived in 4 years, she wrote. I have survived. There is a difference. I knew what the difference was once. I have mostly stopped noticing. The basement was very quiet. Alfred looked at what she had written for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, not soft exactly, but stripped of the deliberate steadiness he normally maintained, as though he had decided that steadiness was a courtesy she didn't need right now. I need to show you something, he said. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a document. Old, the paper gone amber at the edges, the seal at the bottom in wax so ancient it had darkened to near black. He placed it on the table between them and turned it so she could read. It was a bloodline covenant. Royal lineage. Esclick family. Dated 4 centuries prior. The final clause was written in the old script, but Leonora could read it. The Esclick line is bound by ancient compact to stand as shield to the Moon Howl vessel in every generation she walks the earth. Where she is hunted they follow. Where she falls they answer. Leonora looked up. Alfred held her gaze and said nothing. He didn't need to. The royal archives had been stored in Carltonville's oldest building, a stone structure near the upper ward that everyone called the record house and no one ever entered, for reasons that became clear the moment Alfred unlocked the door and the smell hit them. Centuries of paper and cold and the particular staleness of knowledge no one had thought to retrieve. Leonora stepped inside and felt for the first time in 4 years, something that was not vigilance. It took her a moment to identify it. Curiosity. Simple, uncomplicated curiosity, the kind that had nothing to do with survival. She moved through the shelves slowly while Alfred lit the lamps. The documents here were older than anything she had encountered in her own fragmented research. Pact treaties, bloodline records, royal compacts going back to the founding of the fate-bound realm's first territories. She found the Moon Howl references within an hour. There were more than she expected. Far more. Alfred found her sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by open documents, which was apparently not the image he had anticipated, because he stopped in the doorway and something in his expression shifted. Not amusement exactly, but adjacent to it. She held up a page without looking at him. He sat down on the floor beside her and read it. The twin bond was not a metaphor. It was a documented phenomenon, recorded across 6 generations of Esclick bloodline, cross-referenced in 3 separate Moon Howl lineage texts, describing the specific and apparently non-negotiable connection between the 2 lines. An Esclick wolf, the record stated, was born with a particular sensitivity in its bond sense. A gap, an absence, a frequency it registered as missing until the living Moon Howl vessel came within range. At which point the gap closed. The wolf recognized the frequency the way a key recognized a lock. Not by choice, not by instinct in the ordinary sense, but by structure. By the way it had been made. Alfred's ancestors had not served the Moon Howl line out of obligation. Their wolves had been constitutionally incapable of doing otherwise. Leonora read this 3 times. Then she wrote on the chalkboard she had started carrying with her. You didn't choose to follow me into that basement. No, Alfred said. Your wolf heard the silence and couldn't leave it alone. That's one way to put it. She looked at him sideways. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, but there was something different underneath it now. Something that had been there since the covenant document and was becoming harder to categorize as simply duty. She looked back at the records. Her wolf pressed gently against the frost seal, not straining, just present. Aware of him the way a compass needle was aware of north. They developed a shape to their days without discussing it. Mornings in the archive. Afternoons that wandered. The record house garden, which was snow-covered and mostly dead but had a bench in the southern corner that caught 2 hours of pale winter sunlight and was, Leonora decided, the finest place in Carltonville. Walks through the quieter streets when the festival crowds thinned. Shared meals at the healer's work table, which Alfred ate without complaint despite the fact that he was an Alpha King eating basement bread and dried fruit beside medicine crates. He told her about the northern territories. She wrote him observations about Carltonville's wolves that made him raise his eyebrows. One afternoon in the garden he said something about his second's complete inability to read a map without rotating it physically, demonstrating the rotating, and Leonora laughed. It came out of her without warning. Small, surprised, real. She stopped immediately. Alfred looked at her with an expression she had no category for. He didn't remark on it. He simply continued the story. She felt safe. The recognition arrived quietly without drama. She felt safe and she had forgotten what that felt like, and it was almost painful, the way warmth was painful when it reached hands that had been cold too long. The raven arrived at dusk. Black-feathered, frost-marked, carrying a message in no pack seal she recognized. Alfred read it first. His stillness changed quality, hardened into something different from calm. He set it on the table in front of her. 4 words in handwriting like ice fractures. Give us the vessel. Or Carltonville burns. The name on the message was not signed, but Alfred knew it anyway. He told her that evening, quietly without softening it, Victor Frostfang, leader of the Frost Alpha Coalition. The man who had systematically destroyed every Moonhowl bloodline record he could locate over the past 2 decades. Not to erase history, but to ensure that when he finally acquired a living vessel, no one would remember enough to challenge what he did with her. Leonora already knew the name. She had been 11 years old when Victor's wolves came for her family. She remembered the sound before she remembered anything else. Not howling but silence, the specific silence of wolves moving in coordinated formation through snow, the absence of sound that meant something organized and patient was surrounding you. Her mother had pushed her into the root cellar and told her not to make a sound, and Leonora, who had not yet understood what her voice was capable of, had obeyed. She had not made a sound. It had not helped. She wrote none of this for Alfred. She simply read the message again, set it down, and began, with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this before, calculating the fastest route out of Carltonville. The reports reached them over the following 3 days in worsening increments. A village 12 miles east, evacuated, then burned. Wolves from 2 smaller packs vanishing without messages, without bodies, without any trail the scouts could follow into the tree line. Farms on Carltonville's northern boundary going dark overnight. 2 of Alfred's own scouts failing to return from a standard perimeter check, their horses arriving back alone with frost burns across their flanks that had no natural explanation. Alfred fortified the town with the focused efficiency of a man who had prepared for war before. Guard rotations. Reinforced gates. His wolves positioned at intervals that covered every approach. He did all of this without visible alarm, which was either reassuring or terrifying depending on how well you understood what it cost a man like him to maintain that stillness. Leonora watched the preparations and packed a small bag in the back room. Just in case. Old habit. Older than Carltonville, older than the Frost Seal, older than almost everything she currently was. Victor's first strike came not from the north but from directly beneath the lower ward, tunnels, old ones that no one in Carltonville had known existed. 3 frost wolves came through the healer's floor at midnight. Leonora was awake. She was always awake when something was wrong. Her buried wolf had been registering the approach for hours in the only way left to it, a spreading cold behind her sternum, a pressure in her sealed throat that had nothing to do with the magic and everything to do with memory. She moved. Not fast enough. The largest wolf had her by the arm before Alfred came through the basement door. What happened next was not a fight in any conventional sense. Alfred's wolf did not simply emerge. It erupted, outward and upward, vast and white and electric. A spectral form that filled the basement and then exceeded it, tearing through the ceiling not physically but dimensionally, blazing above Carltonville like a second moon. Blue-white lightning. A howl that had no sound but registered in every wolf within a mile as something ancient and non-negotiable answering a threat. The frost wolves released her and ran. Alfred stood in the center of it, not fully himself. His eyes completely white, his wolf's fury wearing him like a vessel it had outgrown. He was going to bring the building down. Leonora stepped in front of him. She pressed her palm flat against his chest. She made no sound. She simply stayed there. Present. Certain. His wolf recognized her the way it always had. The light contracted. Slowly. Then all at once. Alfred came back to himself by degrees, breathing hard, finding her face in the dark. Petra examined her afterward with the expression of someone confirming a diagnosis they had hoped to be wrong about. She pressed careful fingers along Leonora's collarbones, following the blue lines further than they had mapped before. She looked up. The seal is fracturing, she said. Not from outside. She paused. From within. Your wolf is consuming it. If the cracks reach your sternum, she stopped. Started again. The frost magic was never designed to be permanent. It is dissolving, and when it goes. Tell me, Alfred said from the doorway. Petra looked at him. If it shatters before she releases it voluntarily, she said, it will take her with it. The blue cracks reached her sternum on a Tuesday. Leonora discovered them in the small mirror above the remedy shelf, hairline fractures of frostlight spreading downward from her throat in a pattern that looked less like damage and more like something trying to find its shape. Her wolf moved constantly behind the seal now, not violently, not the frantic throwing itself against walls of those first terrible days 4 years ago. Something more purposeful than that. Something that knew, with the patience of a creature that had been waiting a very long time, that the door was nearly open. She said nothing to Alfred. She moved the mirror to the back room where he wouldn't see it. Victor came on a Thursday. No warning. No second message. Just fire. It started at the northern gate, the smell reaching Carltonville center before the sound did, pine smoke and something chemical underneath it, the particular reek of frost magic weaponized into accelerant. By the time the alarm bells rang, 3 buildings on the outer ward were fully involved and Victor's wolves were already through the perimeter in numbers that Alfred's scouts had dramatically underestimated. Alfred's defensive lines held at the main square for 20 minutes. Then Victor's second wave came from the tunnels again. Leonora was in the healer's basement when the floor cracked. She was already moving when the first wolf came through, faster this time, smarter, 3 of them coordinated to different corners of the room so there was no single direction that was safe. She overturned the work table. Bought herself 4 seconds. Made it to the stairs. Alfred met her at the top. He was already fighting. 2 of his wolves flanking him, the frost wolves pressing from the alley entrance, the whole narrow street lit orange from the fire eating the building across the lane. He moved her behind him with one arm and held the line with the other, and for a moment Leonora thought it would be enough, that his wolves were enough, that the defensive math was going to resolve correctly. Then Victor's largest wolf hit Alfred from the side. The sound was enormous. Alfred went down hard against the stone wall, not unconscious but badly hit, one arm at the wrong angle, blood dark across his temple where the stone caught him. He tried to rise. His wolf surged. His body didn't cooperate. Leonora watched him try to stand and fail and try again. The frost cracks spread across her chest in a single sudden map. She felt them go, felt the seal thin in ways it had never thinned before, felt her wolf press against the weakened barrier with a force that was no longer asking permission. She had spent 4 years maintaining the silence. She had been very good at it. She crossed the distance between them and dropped to her knees beside Alfred and pressed her hands against his face, and the word came out of her not as a howl, not as a cry, not as anything so dramatic as what she had feared for 4 years it might become. It came out as a whisper. Alfred. The seal didn't shatter. It cracked, a single fracture through the center of the frost magic, sudden as a frozen river giving way in spring, and the sound that followed was not sound at all but light. Blue-white, enormous, instant. It flooded the street from the ground upward, washing over Alfred's wolves and Victor's wolves alike, pouring through the gaps between buildings and climbing the smoke-filled air above Carltonville's rooftops. And above all of it, enormous and luminous and ancient, the spectral wolf rose. Not Alfred's wolf this time. Hers. White as the frost seal had been. Vast as the sky above the burning town. Its head thrown back in a howl that had no sound in the physical world but that every wolf in Carltonville felt in the base of their spine simultaneously, a frequency that was not a command, not yet, but was absolutely a promise. Victor's advance line stopped moving. Victor himself, 3 streets away, raised his head. His wolf, which had never hesitated in 30 years of conquest, took 1 step backward. The vessel, someone in his formation said. Victor watched the spectral wolf blaze above the burning town and said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, with the specific quality of fury that belongs to a man revising a very long plan. She's awake. Alfred's arm was set and bound by morning. The head wound was shallower than the blood had suggested. Scalp wounds always dramatic, Petra said, in the tone of a woman who had long since run out of patience for dramatic injuries. He would need 3 days of rest, which he was already ignoring by the second morning, reviewing defensive maps from the cot they had moved into the healer's upper ward because he refused to be moved further. Leonora brought him soup. He looked at her when she set it down, really looked the way he had looked at her in the basement that first night, complete and unhurried, and said, "You spoke." She had the chalkboard in her other hand. She set it down too without writing anything on it. "Say something else," he said. Not a command. Barely even a request. Her voice, when it came, was rough. 4 years of disuse and one cracked seal and a night of smoke had made it something fragile and uneven, like an instrument that needed tuning. But it was there. It was hers. "You're eating the soup," she said, "or I'm pouring it on the maps." Alfred ate the soup. The voice came back in increments over the following 2 days. Not the full howl, not yet, the seal still fractured rather than gone, her wolf still pressing at the edges with that patient purposeful force. But words. Sentences. The specific and irreplaceable experience of saying a thing aloud and hearing it exist in the air between two people. She had forgotten how much weight that carried. On the second evening, while the town was quiet and the guard rotation had settled and Alfred was awake and still in the way he was still when he was actually listening rather than simply waiting, Leonora told him everything. Not in fragments this time, not in chalkboard shorthand. Everything. Her mother's voice in the root cellar, "Don't make a sound," and the silence that followed that she had spent years understanding was not her fault and still sometimes woke her at 3 in the morning feeling like it was. The years between 11 and 17 running from pack to pack, always one step ahead of Victor's network, learning to make herself unmemorable in the specific way that kept her alive. The forest fire. The 3 packs. The moment she had understood that her voice was not a gift the world would let her keep safely. The frost magic paste. The cold burning inward. The 6 days her wolf had screamed. She told him about the first winter in Carltonville, when she had been so hungry she had eaten the dried herbs she was supposed to be grinding because they were technically food and nothing else was available. She told him about learning to sleep through the cold. About the specific grief of watching other people live, fully, loudly, taking up appropriate amounts of space, while she practiced being invisible. Alfred listened to all of it without filling the silences she left. That was the thing about him she had come to trust most. He understood that some silences were not waiting to be fixed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not going to claim you." She looked at him. "The covenant gives me the right. Fate apparently agrees. My wolf has had an opinion about this since the moment I walked into your basement." He met her eyes steadily. "None of that is a reason. I want you to choose this. Not because bloodlines align or because the bond is real or because I protected you and you feel you owe me something. Choose it because you want it. Or don't. Either way, I'm not leaving Carltonville without making sure you're safe." Leonora was quiet for a long time. She thought about 4 years of surviving instead of living. About the difference between those two things, which she had written on a chalkboard for him once and which she now understood, sitting in this room with her voice slowly returning, more precisely than she ever had before. "I choose you," she said. "Not fate. You." Something in Alfred's expression shifted. Not surprise, but the specific quality of a man receiving something he had genuinely not allowed himself to expect. His wolf reached toward hers through the fractured seal. Hers answered. Not yet fully, not the completed bond, not the howl, not everything, but enough. A warmth that traveled through the frost cracks like spring through ice, slow and inevitable and entirely different from anything the seal had ever permitted. The raven arrived at midnight. Then the sound followed, thousands of paws in the snow, a rhythm like thunder building at a distance, torchlight visible from Carltonville's northern wall in a line that stretched further than the darkness allowed her to measure. Alfred was already standing at the window. "How many?" Leonora asked. His jaw tightened once. "All of them," he said. The snowstorm arrived with Victor's army, which felt deliberate. Carltonville disappeared into white. The walls, the rooftops, the narrow streets between buildings reduced to shapes and shadows and the orange smear of torchlight pressing through the dark from every direction at once. The sound was immense. Thousands of wolves moving in coordinated formation, frost magic crackling along Victor's front line like weather he had learned to wear, the low resonant howl of bound wolves who had forgotten they had ever had a choice about what they did with their voices. Alfred held the main gate for an hour. Then the gate came down. Leonora stood in the center of the main square with blue light pouring through every crack in her body and understood, with the cold clarity she had come to recognize as the register in which her most important decisions arrived, that she had run out of time for half measures. The frost seal had 4 years ago been the only option available to her. It was not the only option available to her now. Alfred fought at the square's entrance. His wolves flanking him, his movements precise even through exhaustion, his body still doing what it was built to do. But Victor's numbers were swallowing the defensive lines the way the snowstorm was swallowing the light. Completely, without urgency, with the patience of a force that understood it did not need to hurry. She watched Alfred take a hit. Stay standing. Take another. Her wolf pressed against the fractured seal with everything it had left. Now, it said in the only language it possessed. Not words but a pressure, a certainty, a force that had been waiting 4 years for this exact moment with the patience of something that had always known it would come. Now or not at all. Leonora tilted her head back. The moon was directly overhead, enormous through the snowstorm, the blood moon's last night burning red-white behind the clouds. The blue cracks across her chest and throat and collarbones blazed upward toward it like a map of everything she had buried, everything she had traded for survival, everything she had spent 4 years pretending she could live without. She made a choice. Not out of desperation. Not because the alternative was death, though it was. Out of the same clear-eyed deliberateness with which she had sealed the Howl in the first place. The understanding that some moments required everything you had been saving, and that this was the moment, and that she was done saving it. She released the Howl she had buried. It did not begin as sound. It began as light, the blue cracks splitting fully, the frost seal shattering outward from her sternum in a single instant, 4 years of compressed frost magic dissolving into luminescence that flooded the square and climbed the smoke-filled air above Carltonville and kept climbing. Her wolf emerged not gradually but entirely, vast and white and ancient, its spectral form towering above the burning town with its head thrown back and its voice filling every frequency that sound could occupy and several that it couldn't. The Howl reached Victor's bound wolves first. It moved through their forced bonds the way spring moved through ice, not breaking them so much as rendering them unnecessary. The compulsion Victor had spent decades building simply ceasing to be relevant in the presence of something that spoke to the part of them that had existed before compulsion was possible. They stopped moving. Then they turned. The false alphas in Victor's formation went to their knees one by one, not in obeisance but in the involuntary collapse of authority that had never been real, the Howl finding the difference between earned power and stolen power and making it physical, undeniable, structural. Victor himself fell last. He fought it. She could see him fighting it, his wolf thrashing against the frequency, his face a rigid mask of a man who had spent his entire life refusing to kneel. And then he fell, and his army fell with him, and the wolves he had enslaved turned to face him with the specific quality of attention that belongs to creatures who have just remembered what they are. Victor Frostfang was defeated by the wolves he had stolen. It seemed right. The snowstorm broke before dawn. Not gradually, between one moment and the next, the wind simply stopped and the snow settled, and the sky above Carltonville cleared to a blue so clean and pale it looked new. Alfred found her in the center of the square, still standing, the frostlight fading slowly from her skin. He said nothing. He put his hands on her face and checked her eyes, her throat, the places where the cracks had been. They were closing. Slowly. Like wounds that had decided to heal. Her wolf settled inside her. Not sealed, not suppressed, simply home, in the way of something that had found the place it was always meant to be and had no intention of leaving. Still here, she said. Her voice was rough and real and entirely hers. Alfred exhaled once. Then he pressed his forehead against hers and stayed there. Months later, Carltonville rebuilt. The gate was new timber. The lower ward had a real window in the healer's basement, one that actually latched, that let in afternoon light in a way the old one never had. The remedy shelf had been reorganized by someone who was not Petra, which Petra had strong feelings about that she expressed through significant silences rather than direct complaint. Leonora stood on the upper wall at the edge of evening with Alfred beside her, looking out over the fate-bound realm in the direction of the eastern territories, where the first green of an early spring was beginning to show through the snow on the distant hills. She had a voice now. Used it daily. Still found it strange, the specific strangeness of a returned thing, familiar and foreign at once, requiring relearning in small ways she hadn't anticipated. She was learning anyway. Below the wall, in the courtyard, 3 wolves from the eastern pack sat in the snow watching her with the patient, specific attention of animals that had heard something they recognized and followed it here. They were not Alfred's wolves. They were not anyone's wolves, technically, freed bonds, unfastened compulsions, creatures finding their own way back to whatever they had been before Victor. Leonora looked at them for a moment. Then, not loudly, just clearly, just fully, just with the whole unsilenced instrument of the voice she had buried and reclaimed, she called. Not a command. Not a compulsion. An invitation, open-ended, genuine. All three wolves answered. Alfred watched this and said nothing, which was one of the things she loved most about him. She had spent 4 years making herself into a woman no one looked for, no one remembered, no one called by name. She had been very good at it. She had survived it. She had even, in the way of someone who has no better options, occasionally mistaken it for living. She was done mistaking it. Leonora Strohm stood on the wall above Carltonville with her voice intact and her wolf awake, and the realm spread out before her in the thin gold light of a late afternoon in early spring, and she was not hiding. She was not hiding. For the first time in her life, fully, finally, with no asterisks and no arrangements and no collar pulled high against the cold, she was simply here.